So I'm not entirely sure what got into me this week, but for some reason I just really wanted to play around with some crayons, so that's what we're gonna do in this video. I ended up sketching out 4 pretty quick drawings that I was willing to sacrifice for the crayons on this toned gray paper, which is some of my favorite paper. I love using it with colored pencils normally, but I figured crayons would probably work well on it as well. Just, the color being able to show up really nice on the colored paper. Obviously, you can see the white crayon shows up very nicely, and then the colors themselves show up pretty vibrantly as well. The crayons themselves obviously pose a distinct challenge. They don't really like blending together. So for all of these pieces, I ended up kind of selecting a minimal color palette beforehand, and most of the time it was not a very realistic palette. It was definitely more of the surrealistic side of artwork, but I did have fun with this, and it was interesting to play around with kind of a crazy color palette. And like I said, because the crayons don't really blend together too well, it does give it an interesting effect. With this piece, it was more of a realistic style that I was trying, but I did kind of throw in the crazy, I had this crazy bright red-orange color and then the teal, and I was kind of highlighting the different parts of the face with it, which I think turned out to be an interesting look. And if you can see that not really crayon shaped thing in my hand, I found I have a whole drawer in my studio that's kind of what I like to call the challenge drawer. It's mostly Crayola products and more inexpensive art supplies to kind of do these videos with, and I found these. They technically call them twistable colored pencils, but from everything that I could tell, they were just crayons in thin stick form, and so I'm pretty sure I only really ended up using the white and the black, and I just pulled a couple of those out to use for some smaller detail areas, just because another challenge with the crayons obviously is their size. You can sharpen them, but they do wear down pretty easily, and it's not the easiest to get detail with them. So that's kind of why I pulled out those crayon pencil things as well. The other thing about crayons is because they're kind of so patchy, they do end up giving quite a nice and interesting texture on the page. Now, this sketch I thought was going to end up being my easiest one. I was going for more of a solid, kind of more graphic design type look with this illustration, and this one actually ended up being the hardest one to do. I realized when I was picking out my colors that there were pretty much none of the colors that I needed I actually had in crayon form for some ridiculous reason. Not that I was going for crazy colors, but just a beige did not exist in the color that I need. A nice light beige was not a crayon that I owned, and same with a dark brown. So this one was an interesting challenge because I had to kind of be creative and mix up colors. But yeah, one of the things, as I was saying, is because the crayons don't really blend very easily, I decided to start kind of using that to my advantage. With the red hair streaks that you can see there, because like I said, the crayons don't blend, it's actually very easy to keep those streaks nice and visible, because the crayons do not like overlapping each other. So you can definitely achieve some really cool effects with crayons because of their possibly not great qualities. But yeah, I think doing colored outlines and having them be able to show up when normally, you might accidentally color over it. Obviously, because I was using black, some of it did kind of cross over the red, but 90% of the red lines were still pretty pristine by the end of coloring in the hair, which was pretty cool. And again, I'm using my usual technique, which I really need to do a whole video on, because every time I talk about it, lots of you seem to be interested in it. But normally when I'm coloring in something, especially on toned paper, I go for the white highlights first, because most of the time, if you want that area to stay really, really white, even with high quality pencil crayons, they still to a point will not completely cover up the white areas. Even if you color over them, because there is already product there, you will have a difference in texture, and the color that you might accidentally color over top with will not like sitting in that area the same way. So if you want an area to stay super white, that is why I always put the white in first, and then I normally go into the darkest areas and make those the darkest, and then kind of fill in the midtones in between. I even used that kind of principle on these helmet blades at the back here. I ended up making some scuffs in white and then just shading over them, and as you can see, the areas still remained white. This did turn out a little more messily than I had hoped, but it did actually end up working well as kind of a concept or test sketch, because I might end up using kind of this configuration and sketch idea for something later that I have planned. For the next two drawings, I kind of wanted to combine aspects of the last two, so something more realistic while also incorporating more of the kind of graphic design look with using the crayons to create colored outlines and, use that whole aspect of the crayon to my advantage. So like I said, for the next two illustrations, they were meant to kind of go together. So both of them have a very minimal color palette. It was basically black, white, and a light and dark versions of one color. So this one was kind of more of the burgundy, purpley, magenta-y kind of tones, and the next one you will see was more blues. I really didn't want too much craziness going on with the crayons just because of their kind of finicky abilities of blending and stuff, so I wanted to really minimize how many I was using and just, working the crayons to my advantage as best as possible. And I know I said at the beginning that I wasn't exactly sure what had gotten into me this week when I kind of just felt like messing around with crayons, which is true. It might have something to do with the fact that I've been kind of really out of it lately. I've not been to my usual schedule. I haven't had a lot of time to draw in the last really couple of months, so I've just been kind of feeling very out of it, and so the prospect of going back to something like pretty simple and straightforward like a crayon was very appealing to me, especially, just its minimalism in what it can do. Obviously it's a pretty simple medium and it's very not overwhelming, and obviously if it turned out terribly I could just blame it on the crayon and not on my lack of practice lately. No, I'm kidding. No, maybe. Yeah, but I think just the idea that I'm gonna essentially sacrifice these drawings that may or may not turn out great because my hand is pretty stiff, which I know if, you're not an artist, you might not understand what that means, but I'm sure most artists kind of know, the feeling. It's not that you're stiff, it's just you haven't been drawing and it just is a feeling of stiffness. I don't know. It's very hard to explain, but I'm sure lots of you know what that feeling is, that your hand is just not going in the direction that you think it should be, even though you're doing the same things that you normally are doing when you have been drawing more frequently, and it's just a very strange phenomena. But yeah, the idea that these drawings were not meant to be like great works of art, they were just, simple, fairly simple sketches that I was then going to do a fairly minimal coloring job on them as a challenge to myself, and just going back to the idea of what I can do with very minimal tools and kind of work at figuring out how to use those tools to my advantage and not having to do any kind of crazy, just art stuff. I don't know. But you've seen me color these in. I've done them all the same way pretty much. I like adding the white in first, and I guess just focusing more on the highlights and shadows and getting that dimension in with these, less than stellar tools, and not worrying about, 10 more colors to add in and making it look crazy realistic. Obviously these are like crazy surrealist palettes, so I don't have to worry about, making sure the skin tone is the perfect color. It's almost like a black and white study. I just added in a couple of colors to make things look more interesting, but just really going back and focusing on the drawing itself, I guess, more than the execution of the color. Especially this one and the hair, it was much more illustration heavy than lots of the time I'm having to do, especially with watercolor, because, you know, lots of the time the hair is kind of just blobs of color and I don't get in the practice of, you know, doing intensive line work like this. So the crayons definitely were helping with a lot of different aspects and kind of getting me back into the swing of drawing and illustrating and kind of getting out of possibly the ruts that, you know, constantly creating artwork can put you in. You know, you get comfortable with doing certain techniques and then you just kind of stay there even if you don't realize it. For this one, I decided that it was looking a bit lifeless, so I actually found this kind of peach color to kind of bring in some warmth and just make the skin come alive a bit more. Obviously, with the magenta color scheme, I must have had another magenta tone instead of just the couple of blues I was using for this one, so I definitely needed like a third color to go along with the white, and I guess probably because I wasn't using black for this one, my dark color was the dark blue. So yeah, I grabbed this peach color, which of course this is when the crayons decided to start blending into each other. So the peach was kind of picking up some blue in different areas, and some of the areas turned a bit green, which I wasn't in love with, but I did manage to kind of white it out with the white crayon and kind of fix a few areas. So a bit of a noob mistake with color theory there, but in the end, I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out as well. I think the shading on this face was a lot better than the other one, so that's also just, you know, the blending of the crayons and creating that green color probably kind of, it evened itself out in the end. Also, after doing all of these illustrations, I actually had to go out and buy another small pack of crayons, which thankfully are not that expensive because I kept cracking the white, so my white crayon is in now like 5 pieces and it was time for a new one. So if you're feeling in an art rut, maybe you should get yourself a box of crayons and play around with them. You never know how much it might help. But that is everything. Let me know which one of these illustrations you like the most, and if you'd like to see more videos of me playing around with crayons. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.